For over a century, we've pictured Neanderthals as little more than Shadow's brutish men, dragging clubs through the Ice Age, hunting mammoths while their silent women lingered near the fire. But what if that image is not only inaccurate, but deeply unfair? What if, buried in layers of bone and time, we've missed the real story entirely? Recent discoveries, from fractured skulls to healed wounds, reveal a different narrative, one etched not in myth, but in marrow. This story begins with three ancient women. Their bones do not whisper, they testify. Of trauma, of survival, of care under impossible conditions. These were not passive mates. They were warriors, foragers, mothers, and witnesses. This isn't a tale of beasts or martyrs. It's the story of a species we thought we knew, told not by its men, but by the enduring, scarred, and fiercely human lives of its women. For decades to centuries, even the popular image of Neanderthals has been curiously narrow. A single frame dominates public imagination: the male hunter, hulking and primitive, stalking prey across a frozen tundra. His brow is heavy, his body wrapped in crude furs, and in his grip, a sharpened spear. He is the prototype of man before history, before civilization. Behind him, barely acknowledged, is the woman. If she appears at all, she is cast in silhouette sitting beside a fire, clutching a child, her gaze lowered, silent. Supportive, secondary. This image, so familiar in textbooks, museum displays, documentaries, and even cartoons, was never neutral. It emerged from a modern lens shaped by post-industrial ideals of division between labor, between genders, and between worth. But it was rarely questioned. In the early days of paleoanthropology, it was men who led the digs, men who read the bones, and men who wrote the stories. And consciously or not, they cast the past in their own image, a world of male action, female reaction. But the earth does not lie, and lately, the bones have begun to speak. A new generation of researchers, fueled by advances in forensic science, biomechanics, and a willingness to re-examine old assumptions, has begun to reconstruct a richer, deeper picture of Neanderthal life. And in this picture, women do not simply wait. They work. They endure. They survive. They shape the world alongside their male counterparts, not from the shadows, but shoulder to shoulder. Skeletal analysis has been key. When anthropologists began to examine the musculoskeletal markers of Neanderthal remains without preconception, they noticed something surprising. Female Neanderthals exhibited levels of physical development nearly on par with males. Their bones bore signs of robusticity, muscular stress, and repetitive strain. This wasn't just the result of carrying children or gathering berries. These were the hallmarks of active physical lives, of pulling hides, climbing slopes, napping flint, or navigating treacherous Ice Age terrain. Wear patterns on teeth suggest the use of teeth as tools: gripping, slicing, processing. And those patterns aren't exclusive to male remains. In fact, some of the most heavily worn dentition is found in female individuals, suggesting intensive processing of materials, perhaps hides or fibers, both essential to survival. But bones tell more than stories of labor. They also whisper of pain. In recent years, forensic trauma studies have uncovered evidence of injuries among female Neanderthal, remains broken limbs, fractured ribs, and, most hauntingly, cranial trauma. These injuries mirror the patterns found in males, indicating that both genders faced physical danger. This could mean that women were present on hunts, or that they engaged in defense during predator attacks. Or it may mean that interpersonal violence was not confined to male-on-male conflict. This is where interpretation becomes both delicate and profound. Were these injuries the result of shared hardship? Or were they the shadows of hierarchy and harm within the group? We may never know with certainty, but their presence demands we look beyond myth. In every scar, every healed fracture, we see evidence of experience, of someone who was not just present but necessary, vital, human. This growing body of evidence forces us to ask, how much of our view of prehistory has been shaped not by what we found, but by what we expected to find? The story of Neanderthal women is not one of quiet domesticity. It is a chronicle of endurance, of effort, of contribution written not in ink, but in calcium and trauma, preserved in the cold soil of Europe and Asia. To ignore them is not just to do a disservice to women, it is to miss half the story of who we are. And perhaps more importantly, it is to miss the chance to finally hear the voices that history silenced long ago. In the cold calculus of survival, the Ice Age made no allowances for leisure or hierarchy. Every hand mattered, every body bore weight. And in Neanderthal society defined not by comfort, but by endurance, the roles of men and women were not divided neatly along lines of passivity and power. They were shared, as were the dangers. For much of modern history, early reconstructions of prehistoric life relied on modern assumptions that males were the hunters, the tool makers, the adventurers, females, the nurturers, gatherers, and caregivers. The archaeological record was often interpreted through these lenses. Bones of men were studied for evidence of warfare and movement. Bones of women, often relegated to the margins, if examined at all. But as osteological methods advanced, and as researchers began reassessing old finds with new technology and fewer assumptions, a more nuanced picture began to emerge. One of surprising parity. A picture not of separate spheres, but of shared burdens. Skeletal remains of female Neanderthals tell a story that contradicts traditional gendered assumptions. Their bones thicker, denser than modern female humans show clear markers of physical stress and muscular development. Muscle attachment sites reveal that these women were powerful, their bodies shaped by years of intense physical activity. They were not sedentary. They were active agents in a world that demanded everything of them. Signs of repetitive strain injuries, especially in the elbows, shoulders, and knees, suggest a life spent hauling, lifting, scraping, kneeling, skinning, carving. Their hands and wrists show indications of overuse, likely from constant tool use or hide processing. These weren't brief chores. These were all-day, lifelong tasks essential to the group's survival. Foot and ankle stress markers indicate that Neanderthal women, like men, traveled frequently across uneven, hazardous terrain. They likely foraged far from home, searching for plants, roots, medicinal herbs, or animal remains. This wasn't leisurely gathering. This was demanding work, often carried out in freezing temperatures, often while carrying children or tools, with the constant risk of injury or predator encounter. An injury, indeed, is where the story grows darker and more complex. Many female Neanderthal skeletons exhibit signs of trauma, fractured ribs, long bone breaks, even cranial injuries. Some of these are consistent with accidental injury falls, slips, or blows from collapsing materials. But others suggest more dynamic events, defensive wounds on forearms, facial fractures that align with interpersonal violence, or patterns that match those seen in male hunting-related trauma. In fact, one of the more disturbing insights from comparative analysis is that the distribution and type of injuries between males and females often overlap significantly. This blurs the line between assumption and evidence. If women were not present on hunts or exposed to combat, why would their injuries so closely mirror those of men? The answer seems clear. They were not bystanders. They were not protected. They were there. This raises further questions we may never fully answer. Did these injuries come from shared hardship or internal conflict? Were women attacked by predators or by their own kind? Some wounds suggest targeted blows, not accidents. And yet, others show signs of healing evidence that these women were not abandoned, but cared for. One thing is certain. The old image of the Neanderthal woman as passive, domestic, and delicate does not survive under forensic scrutiny. She carried weight. She endured strain. She walked the same paths, faced the same threats, and bore the same scars. To study Neanderthal life without accounting for the physical contributions of women is to miss a crucial half of the story, not only of gender, but of the very nature of survival. In an Ice Age world, danger was not selective, nor was resilience. The skeleton does not lie. It records impact, repetition, force, and failure. And in the skeletons of Neanderthal women, we find the signature of lives lived in full of bodies that bore not only children, but the burdens of a world unrelenting in its demands. They did not watch history happen. They helped write it with their hands, with their labor, and with their pain. The fossil record speaks in silence, but sometimes that silence is broken by a fracture. Among the most unsettling discoveries in Neanderthal anthropology are not the tools, the fire pits, or even the burials. They are the breaks, the cracks, the dents pressed into bone by force long ago. And in recent years, a pattern has emerged, dawn that raises questions more difficult than science alone can answer. Cranial and facial trauma has been found in both male and female Neanderthal remains. But in women, these injuries carry an additional weight. They are not always random. Some appear precise, repeated, healed. They speak of encounters not with nature, but with someone else, possibly someone known. Blunt force trauma to the front of the skull. Depressions just above the eye socket. Slashes carved into the parietal bone. These are not the kinds of wounds caused by a falling rock or a clumsy misstep on ice. They suggest proximity, confrontation, and most chillingly intent. To be clear, trauma in prehistoric remains is not unusual. Life in glacial Europe was violent by default. Danger came from every direction: saber-toothed cats, shifting terrain, falling branches, freezing winds. But the specific nature of some injuries, especially those found on the front of the skull where a fall is least likely hints at something disturbingly human: interpersonal violence. One must ask, what kind of society did Neanderthals build? Was it founded on mutual reliance or dominance? Did their small, intimate groups foster connection or conflict? We know they lived in bands of 15 to 30 individuals. Such tight-knit communities require cooperation, shared effort, and trust. But they also generate pressure, frustration, jealousy, hierarchies, whether spoken or enforced. In this crucible of necessity, emotions may have ignited into aggression. The presence of healed trauma complicates the picture. A skull split open and left untended would tell a short story. But many of these women lived on. Their wounds closed. Their bones reknit. This suggests not only that they endured the violence, but that they were cared for afterward. Someone fed them, protected them, nursed them back. Violence did not necessarily mean exile. And so we are left with a paradox. The hand that struck may not have been the same one that healed, but both existed within the same small world. Some scholars argue that such trauma might reflect accidents in hunting, domestic work, or predator attacks. And that is possible. But even when framed as chance, the injuries still reveal the intensity of Neanderthal life, one where no one, male or female, lived far from harm's reach. Yet the pattern remains. The location, the repetition, the healing. These are not the signs of isolated events. They point to a reality of shared danger, not just from the outside world, but from within the group. This challenges our assumptions about Neanderthals as either gentle proto-humans or savage beasts. The truth, as always, is more complex. They were capable of both kindness and cruelty, as we are. They fought and they forgave. They injured and they mended. In their bones, we see not only pain but the cost of community. And perhaps that's what makes this chapter so hard to read. It is not distant. It is not foreign. It is all too familiar. The history of violence, especially violence within, did not begin in cities or kingdoms. It began in shelters of bone and snow, in families struggling against extinction. And sometimes, the wounds we find are not just archaeological. They are echoes of what still lingers in us. In 1979, beneath the soil of a hillside in southwestern France, a quiet exhumation took place that would later challenge how we think about Neanderthals and how we remember their women. The fossil was labeled simply Sansais 1, just another fragment among the countless ancient remains cataloged in Europe. But this one was different. She was a young woman, a Neanderthal, and she lived roughly 39,000 years ago in the edge of time, at the waning twilight of her species. This was the final act of Neanderthal history, when Homo sapiens had begun their steady expansion across the continent. Our people were fading, their numbers shrinking, their territories fragmenting. They were being outnumbered, perhaps outcompeted. It was a time of scarcity, of displacement, and of growing tension between two human worlds. Yet the story Sansais 1 tells is not one of extinction, not directly. It is not about species loss or evolutionary competition. It is about pain, resilience, and the remarkable capacity for care. Her skull bore a wound of violent, unmistakable slash 7 centimeters long, slicing across her parietal bone. This wasn't the result of a fall. It wasn't a predator's bite. The nature of the cutit's depth, direction, and sharpness suggests a tool was used, likely a hafted blade, flint, or obsidian mounted on a wooden handle designed for precision. This was a strike meant to harm, perhaps even to kill. And yet, she did not die. The margins of the wound showed signs of healing, bone regeneration, the slow, painful process of recovery that only occurs over time, days, weeks, maybe months. Which means one thing above all else: someone helped her. Imagine what that would require in the Ice Age. A woman with a traumatic cranial injury would be vulnerable to everything: infection, cold, starvation, predators. She would be dizzy, weakened, perhaps unable to walk. She would need rest. She would need food and water. She would need protection not for hours, but for weeks. And someone gave it. This is where the story turns. The blow itself reveals the threat of violence, but the healing? That reveals something more powerful: compassion. In the heart of the Ice Age, amidst hunger, cold, and an uncertain future, someone paused to care for a wounded woman. They did not leave her behind. They did not discard her as a burden. They carried her, fed her, watched over her while she lay defenseless. They acted not just with instinct, but with empathy. This simple fact a healed wound disrupts the stereotype of Neanderthals as cold and unfeeling brutes. It suggests a level of social depth, of humanity, that goes beyond survival. It implies emotional bonds, commitment, perhaps even love. Who struck the blow? We'll never know. Was it a rival? A clan member? A sapiens invader? The fossil is silent on that point. But what it does say, unmistakably, is that healing happened. And where there is healing, there is care. The story of the Sansais woman is not just the story of injury. It is the story of someone who endured when she shouldn't have. Someone whose life was not ended by violence, but reshaped by the will of others to keep her alive. In the long arc of human history, this moment matters, because it reminds us that even in prehistory, long before medicine, long before morality as we define it today, there was already something deeply familiar, the choice to protect the vulnerable. And that, perhaps, is the most human act of all. The fossil record rarely speaks softly. It shows us trauma, wear, the scars of survival etched into bone. But every now and then, it whispers something unexpected. And in the case of the Sansais woman, that whisper becomes a revelation. A gash deep, deliberate marked her skull. But what turned that wound into a story was not the blow itself. It was the healing. In an age long before modern medicine, in a world without stitches, gauze, or antibiotics, a woman survived a grievous head injury. The implications are staggering. She didn't survive because her body was stronger. She survived because someone chose to help. To heal from that kind of trauma, you need more than time. You need shelter. You need warmth. You need human hands to bring food, to keep predators at bay, to stay near in the dead of night when the fever rises. You need community. You need care. That single act of healing, captured in calcified bone, reveals a side of the Neanderthal world that science books too often overlook: the emotional infrastructure of survival. For too long, Neanderthals were painted in broad, beastly strokes, primitive, unspeaking, ruled by impulse. But the evidence is shifting. What we see in the Sansais woman is not brute force, but compassion under pressure. The kind that surfaces not in moments of strength, but in the fragile hours after trauma. It's easy to imagine violence in prehistory. It's harder but far more important to imagine tenderness. And yet, here it is. Brutality and empathy locked together in a frozen moment of time. A woman struck down, then lifted back up by those around her. Whether by family, mate, or clan, someone made the choice to keep her alive when it would have been easier not to. Easier to walk on, to protect the healthy, to leave the wounded to the cold. But they didn't. They stayed. And in that staying, they revealed something ancient and enduring. The roots of human compassion run deeper than civilization itself. That's what makes this story powerful. It's not just about survival in the Ice Age, it's about meaning in the margins. It's about how even in a world shaped by scarcity and silence, humanity, true humanity, still found a way to emerge. We'll never know their names. We'll never know who fed her, who watched over her, who chose her life over their convenience. But we know they existed. And in that knowledge, something changes not just about how we see Neanderthals, but how we see ourselves. Because compassion, like the bones that carried it, survives. Long before the Sansais woman ever walked beneath Ice Age skies, another Neanderthal woman lived and endured in a wind-scoured hill above the Krapina River in present-day Croatia. Her name, as we know it, is Craina 3. She is one of over 80 Neanderthal individuals unearthed from the Krapina rock shelter, a site rich with bones, stone tools, and clues to one of the earliest known Neanderthal populations. Yet among the many lives once lived there, hers carries a scar that refuses to be silent. A shallow depression pressed into the frontal bone of her skull. Blunt force trauma. Clean. Distinct. Not the jagged randomness of a fall from a rocky ledge, nor the puncture of a hunting accident. This was something closer. Personal. Direct. Face to face. And yet, like the Sansai woman tens of thousands of years later, Craina 3 survived. Her wound healed, slowly, silently, with no bandages or antiseptics. The bone thickened. Time closed the gap. And with it, a question opened. What kind of society lets a wounded woman live? The blow to Craina 3's skull wasn't fatal, but it was memorable. Because it reveals two things about her world, both hard to face. First, violence existed, and it touched women. Second, so did recovery. Craina 3's life offers no clear motive, no court record, no context. Was she struck by another member of her band in a moment of rage? Did she step into a dispute not meant for her? Did she fall victim to the kind of dominance that sometimes masks itself as order? Or did she fall? That ambiguity haunts the fossil record. But what's not ambiguous is this: she lived on, after the pain, after the impact, after the blood dried and the wound scarred. She stayed, and someone stayed with her. Because injuries to the head are not healed in solitude. Just as with Sansais, Craina 3 likely relied on others for food, protection, warmth. This too tells us something elemental. Neanderthal groups did not discard the wounded. They adapted around them. They paused for healing. Perhaps the most remarkable fact isn't that the blow was dealt, but that the story continued after it. Craina 3 lived roughly 130,000 years ago, nearly 90,000 years before Sansai. Her bones are older than many mountains. But her survival, her healing gives us a continuity. It connects two women who never knew each other, across geography, time, and suffering. Together, their wounds form a pattern. Neanderthal women were not protected ornaments. They were participants in life's hardest edges. And when they were broken, they were mended not just by time, but by the hands of others. Craina 3 may not have left tools or art. She may not be remembered by name in any oral tradition, but her skull, battered and then restored by biology and community, speaks with quiet dignity. It says, "I was hurt, but I was not abandoned." And that may be the most human thing of all. If the bones at Krapina could speak, they would not shout. They would whisper softly, solemnly of a time before memory, when survival was not only physical, but cultural. At first glance, the Krapina rock shelter seems like many other Neanderthal sites. Fragments of skulls, broken tools, ashes, animal bones, cracked for marrow. But look closer, and something extraordinary emerges. A story not of mere endurance, but of meaning. Among the remains, archaeologists found 8 eagle talons each, one pierced, shaped, or worn smooth, as though strung together or handled often. Eagle talons are not food. They are not weapons. They are symbols. To take down an eagle requires courage, precision, and perhaps even reverence. To wear its claws? That is no accident. That is identity. Some of the Neanderthal teeth at Krapina were also deliberately removed, not broken by trauma, but extracted with care. For what purpose? It's impossible to say for certain. But in Homo sapiens, similar practices occur in initiation rites, mourning rituals, or symbols of belonging. Could the Neanderthals have had their own versions? Did they grieve? Did they mark adulthood, leadership, or loss in ceremony? And then, there are the pigment traces of red ochre, black manganese, not just on rocks, but on tools, and possibly even on skin or bone. Paint without language is still a statement. A Neanderthal who covered themselves in ochre didn't do so for camouflage. They did it to be seen. These Sansais talons, altered teeth, pigments suggest that Krapina was more than a camp. It was a community, a culture, a place not just of gathering, but of belonging. Now revisit Craina 3, a woman struck, a wound healed, but not alone. In the context of Krapina's symbolic artifacts, her survival takes on new meaning. She was not merely tolerated. She was protected, valued, part of something bigger than herself. Her continued existence after injury implies intention not just by her own body, but by her people. Who sat beside her as she recovered? Who brought her water? Who helped her sleep when the pain throbbed through her skull? This was not the brute society we once imagined, where strength ruled and weakness was discarded. This was a society with bonds deeper than the need to eat or fight. Perhaps they lacked formal language, but they spoke in actions. They spoke in care. They spoke in ritual. And so, at Krapina, we glimpse not just the evolution of species, but the evolution of meaning. The first flickers of belief, of identity, of a shared sense that pain mattered, and survival was something to honor, not just endure. In Craina, 3's healed skull, in the wear-polished talons, in the dark streaks of ochre left behind, we see not savagery, but solidarity. And maybe, in that ancient Croatian shelter, buried beneath ash and time, humanity was already learning its oldest lesson, that to care for one another is not a weakness. It is the beginning of civilization. Far from the wind-swept shelters of Europe, buried beneath the ancient limestone cliffs of southeastern China, another story sleeps. It isn't wrapped in fire-hardened spears or pigments, but in something quieter, subtler. A skull, half buried, part forgotten, yet destined to stir the foundations of everything we thought we knew. Lion Rock, 1958. Amidst the rubble of quarrying and time, Chinese researchers unearthed what appeared to be a fossilized human skull, thick-boned, heavy-jawed, weathered by millennia. And yet, not quite like anything they'd seen before. They called her Mara. The Mara skull defied easy classification. Her brow ridge was massive, almost armor-like evocative of classic Neanderthal traits. Her cranial vault, however, rose higher than expected, curving toward the dimensions of early Homo sapiens. Her facial structure held hints of something else, entirely, possibly, Denisovan, or a ghost lineage yet unnamed. And therein lies the enigma. Dated to between 130,000 and 230,000 years ago, Mara may have walked the earth long before the Neanderthals met their end in Europe. Yet she lived in a region few associate with them. Was she a lone Neanderthal outlier? A Denisovan cousin? Or evidence of a hybrid population, born from interbreeding in the deep shadows of prehistory? Unlike the well-documented Neanderthals of France or Croatia, Mara doesn't come with a cultural toolkit. No eagle talons, no fire rings, no ochre. But absence is not emptiness. The shape of her skull suggests adaptation to cold, thick bones to conserve heat, a wide nasal aperture for warming breath. The environment she lived in was likely harsh monsoonal winters, dense forests, mountain winds that cut like flint. And yet, she endured. Mara's very existence expands the map of ancient humanity. Her features echo across species boundaries. She challenges the tidy lines drawn by textbooks, the neat evolutionary trees that make our story look so linear. In truth, evolution was never linear. It was braided a river of migrations and minglings, of borrowed genes and crossed paths. Mara may be one such bright a living hinge between ancient worlds. And just like the women of Krapina or Sansais, Mara holds another secret. Above her robust brow, a crescent-shaped depression marks her skull. Blunt force trauma delivered, not by nature, but by impact. The bone had begun to heal. She survived. Like them, in that healing is a question. Did someone help her? Was there a tribe? A partner? A daughter who kept her warm? Did she rest beneath the stone overhangs of Lion Rock, bones aching, eyes watchful? Has someone brought her roots to chew or water to drink? We'll never know. But we do know this. Mara was not alone in prehistory. Not entirely. Her bones now sit in silence, but their presence a robust, undecided, defiant, speaks volumes. Mara is a whisper from the East, a reminder that the Neanderthal story didn't end in Europe. It echoed across the mountains of Asia, in skulls we can't quite name, and in lineages we may never fully trace. And maybe, just maybe, the reason her identity feels uncertain is because she belongs to all of them. A child of collisions, a daughter of overlap, a survivor of silence. It was a wound, not just a scar in bone, but in time. A crescent-shaped depression etched into the thick brow ridge of the woman we now call Marasilent witness to a blow delivered over 100,000 years ago. And in that curve, shallow but deliberate, lies one of the oldest human questions. What happened here? The injury wasn't random. Its precise arc, its position above the left brow, and the depth of trauma all point to an object wielded with force, perhaps a stone hand tool, a club, or even a fist wrapped in Ice Age fury. It was violence, but not fatal. That in itself is a miracle. Because the bone had begun to knit itself together, Mara survived. That small fact transforms the wound from a grim artifact into a story of resilience and of something even rarer, compassion in the Pleistocene. Think of what survival meant back then. No antibiotics, no sterile bandages, no sutures or antiseptics. Infection could creep in with a breath. A concussion could spiral into death. And yet she lived. Long enough for bone to heal, for tissue to mend, for whatever had broken her body not to break her entirely. Someone must have been there. Someone, whether kin, mate, or friend, had to bring her food, shelter her from the wind, shield her while she lay vulnerable. In a world of predators and scarcity, caring for an injured companion was a gambler risk that could mean death for the caregiver too. But that risk was taken, and Mara, like Sansais in France and Craina III in Croatia, stands as evidence that Neanderthal care was not theoretical, it was practiced. Not a hypothesis, but a lived behavior, fossilized in calcium and scar. What does this tell us? It tells us that strength among Neanderthals wasn't brute force alone. It was interdependence. It was social intelligence. It was empathy born not from luxury but necessity. In a hostile world, the only way to endure was together. The Crescent wound also breaks the stereotype of passive women in caves, waiting while the men return from the hunt. Mara wasn't waiting. The location of the trauma frontal, deliberate and close range, suggests she was in the thick of it. A confrontation, a defense, a fight for survival. And she bore the mark proudly, in flesh first and in bone forever. That crescent isn't just an injury. It's a signature of survival. It echoes across continents and through time. From Sansais' slash to Craina's depression to Mara's crescent, it's a triad of trauma, yes, but also of endurance. Each woman, harmed but unbroken. Each wound, telling a story not of defeat but of getting back up. We often say bones don't lie, but perhaps it's more accurate to say bones remember what we've forgotten. They remember the night someone didn't turn away. They remember that caring for the wounded isn't modern, it's ancient. And in remembering Mara and that curved wound above her eye, we are reminded that even before language, there were gestures that meant, "You still matter. I will not leave you." That is what the crescent reveals, and what a revelation it is. The bones tell us more than stories of damage. They reveal patterns, not just of injury, but of response. Across millennia and continents, 3 Neanderthal women, Sansais, Craina, and Mara, each bore wounds that differed in weapon, force, and intent. But in the silence of their fossils, one common thread emerges. They all survived. That fact alone should stop us in our tracks. Let's begin with Sansais, the woman from what is now France. The sharp 7-centimeter cut across her parietal bone wasn't random. It was precise, delivered with a tool likely designed for harm. It came from behind or the side, meaning she may never have seen it coming. This was not a clumsy fall, it was targeted violence. But still, her skull shows signs of healing. The wound closed. Infection didn't win. Someone stayed with, herfed her, cleaned the injury, guarded her as she lay incapacitated in a cold and dangerous world. Then there's Craina 3, the older woman from Krapina, Croatia. Her trauma was blunter, more diffuse, a depression on the forehead. It could have come from a fight, a shove, a fall. But the placement frontal suggests direct engagement. She may have faced her attacker. She may have been defending herself. And again, her wound healed. Her people did not walk away. Finally, Mara, whose crescent-shaped indentation above the brow reads like a symbol. The wound is old, but the message it carries is modern. Survival requires others. Her injury implies a blow from a stone or a club, perhaps accidental, perhaps not. But it was deep, and yet the bone thickened around it. She endured. And someone, somewhere in the cold expanse of Pleistocene China, made sure she did. These are not isolated acts of luck. They are data points in a forgotten pattern, evidence of a cultural norm of care. These women did not simply get lucky. They were part of something bigger, something communal, and perhaps something even moral. Behind each wound was a decision not to abandon, not to move on, but to protect, to tend, to help. This, in many ways, reshapes what we thought we knew about Neanderthals. They were not lone brutes roaming the tundra. They were members of tight-knit group tribes or families where the value of an individual did not expire the moment they became a burden. These injuries, healed and sustained, whisper of loyalty, of kinship, and of a deep, quiet humanity beneath the muscle and fur. And if these patterns hold across 3 women, thousands of miles apart, and separated by nearly 100,000 years, then they may not be anomalies. They may be windows into a Neanderthal ethic, a world where pain was acknowledged and care was deliberate. In our own modern society, we often assume that compassion emerged only recently, that medicine and morality grew with civilization. But here, in these ancient wounds, lies the truth. Care is prehistoric, older than cities, older than language, perhaps even older than us. So when we look at these three skulls, we aren't just looking at injuries, we're looking at something far more enduring. The memory of being held, the echo of being seen. These women's pain was real, but so was the compassion that followed it. That is the true pattern, and that is the legacy they leave us. History, especially deep histories, rarely kind to women. The further back we look, the more they vanish into silence. In textbooks, in museums, in documentaries, the narrative of early humanity has too often been built around the masculine silhouette. The hunter, the warrior, the explorer. Women are shadows, nameless figures, tending fires, holding children, surviving behind the scenes. But the bones tell a different story. And in the case of Neanderthal women, they demand that we rethink not just their role, but the very structure of prehistoric life. Across 3 continents, spanning over 100,000 years, 3 female Neanderthal fossils, Sansais, Craina, and show us something profound. These women were not passive observers of the Ice Age. They were its participants, its witnesses, and in many ways, its survivors. Their bodies bear not just the marks of domestic life, but of confrontation, hardship, and resilience. Sansais, with a healed slash across her skull, was likely the victim of a direct and deliberate act of violence. Yet, she lived on, cared for during recovery. That care was not a passive gesture, it was an act of recognition. She mattered. She was not discarded. Craina 3, from Krapina, bore the signs of blunt trauma to her frontal bone, a blow suggesting confrontation, not accident. Her wound also healed, slowly and fully. That healing, like her wound, speaks volumes not just about injury, but about endurance. And endurance, for Neanderthals, was not just physical, it was social. You only survived if you were wanted. Mara, unearthed from the hills of China, bore her own Crescent scare, a brutal reminder of the cost of existence in a harsh world. Yet again, she did not face extinction alone. She was part of a network, a clan, a people who would not let her die. These are not the stories of silent firekeepers. These are the stories of women who bled, who broke, who got back up because someone stood beside them. So what does this mean for how we see gender in early human history? It means we were wrong. Not because women weren't nurturing or collaborative, but because we assumed that's all they were. It means the Ice Age was not a theater of lone male heroism, but a collective drama where strength came in many forms. In muscle, yes, but also in caregiving, in healing, in staying. And it challenges something even deeper, understanding of humanity itself. If Neanderthals, often seen as our brutish cousins, could forge communities where injured women were nursed back to life, then perhaps compassion is not a product of civilization. Perhaps it is older than cities, older than writing, older than us. Perhaps it is human nature at its core. To rewrite the role of women in prehistory is not merely to add a few names to the story. It is to reshape the story entirely. Because without them, it is incomplete. Their wounds, their recoveries, their sheer presence in the fossil recordal point to something powerful. They endured. They mattered. They were not background. In the cracked skulls of Sansais, Craina, and Mara, we see not just Tremasi agency. We see women who bore the weight of survival with dignity, whose lives spoke louder than the myths we wrote in their absence. And perhaps most importantly, we see ourselves reflected in them. They are not just bones. They are biographies etched in calcium, stained by time, preserved in silence. And when we listen closely, we realize they've been speaking all along. From the frozen rock shelters of France to the wind-scoured hills of ancient China, the remains of Neanderthal women whisper a truth too long buried beneath our assumptions. They speak not in words, but in fractures and scar tissue, in worn joints and healed skulls, in places where the past pressed too hard and left its imprint. They tell us that even in the darkest hours of human prehistory, there was something more enduring than violence. There was care. And that truth changes everything. When we think of legacies, we tend to imagine monuments, pyramids, cathedrals, empires. But some of the most profound legacies are quieter. They are not carved in stone, but carried in bloodlines and memory. The legacy of Neanderthal women isn't a tale of conquest or innovation. It's one of resilience, of surviving a world so brutal that even shelter was a luxury. Even kindness was a gamble. It is easy to reduce prehistory to tools and teeth, to count fire pits and spearheads. But the bones of these women add something else: context. They remind us that the story of humanity is not merely one of physical evolution, but of emotional depth, of interdependence, of pain shared and endured together. Sansais, Craina, and Mara were not anomalies. They were not the exception to a male-dominated rule. They were central to their communities, not just because they could forage or process hides or birth children, but because they could suffer and still rise again. Their survival is proof not just of physical strength, but of social strength. They were not left behind. And what does that say about the people who stood beside them? It says Neanderthals, long dismissed as savage, emotionless brutes, were something far more complex, capable of violence, yes, but also of tenderness, of loyalty, of kinship strong enough to fight death back with bare hands and raw will. That's not primitive. That's profoundly human. And that is their true legacy. For centuries, we looked at Neanderthal bones as remnants of a failed species in evolutionary cul-de-sac. But perhaps it is we who failed them by not listening, by not seeing that inside those fractured skulls and weathered femurs lay the blueprints of something vital, our capacity to endure through connection. Sansais, Craina, Mara, not nameless relics, but women of flesh and spirit who fought, who healed, who were held by others when they could not stand on their own, and who tens of thousands of years later still reach across time to tell us something essential: that care is not weakness. It is survival. Their bones may rest in museums, but their legacy walks with us, still in the DNA we carry, in the compassion we choose, in the fire we keep alive. They were not beasts. They were survivors, carriers of memory, keepers of the fire. At Prehistoric Shadows, we don't dig into the past for spectacle. We don't seek monsters in the dirt or legends to dazzle the eye. We seek truth, the kind that doesn't scream, but endures. The kind that survives not in grand monuments or mythical warriors, but in the fractured rib of a forgotten woman, in a healed skull, in a handprint on a cave wall no one has touched in 40,000 years. The story of Neanderthal women is not a curiosity. It's not an aside. It is a correction. For too long, history has been filtered through the eyes of the loudest victors, through assumptions, bias, and projections. We've reduced entire species, entire lifetimes into footnotes based on what we thought was important: muscle, tools, conquest. But the bones tell another story, one that was never silent, only ignored. In these women Sansais, Craina, Murad don't just find archaeological anomalies. We find ourselves. We find proof that strength has always come in many forms, not just the thrust of a spear, but the patience to care for the wounded. Not just survival through domination, but survival through compassion. And that's why this channel exists. At Prehistoric Shadows, we ask deeper questions. Not just how ancient people lived, but why their stories still matter. We follow the shadows cast by firelight, the echoes hidden in bones, the humanity buried in forgotten corners of time. Because if we want to understand who we are today, we must listen to those who came before us. Not just the warriors, but the witnesses. So, if this story moved you, if it unsettled your assumptions or stirred something long, buried, don't walk away. Subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows, because in every fossil, there's a voice. And it's time finally to start listening.